Please join me in giving Russell Arben Fox a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
Thank you, John, for that introduction. It occurs to me that every time I've spoken at the Pachyderm Club, I express my appreciation to John, and he deserves that repeated expressions of respect. There are few people that I have gotten to know in the 13 years that my family has lived here in Wichita, and as our children have grown up, and as I've developed different programs at my place of work and made connections with lots of different organizations and people. There's few individuals out of all of that that have struck me as constantly engaged and interested and committed to encouraging the best of other people, encouraging a wrestling with ideas, encouraging education in exactly the way that Carl was referring to when he was reading the Pachyderm preamble there. The idea of getting people aware and getting people involved. A lot of us do that as to the best of our ability. Just looking around at this group, I see a lot of individuals who I cross paths with in different contexts and in different organizations. But John really stands out in my experience. So thank you, John. I was also particularly appreciative of this invite because in the past when I've come and I've presented here, he's wanted me to talk about things connected to my area of expertise. So I've talked about various historical or political topics in connection with government or with an upcoming election or in reviewing a just passed election. I've never before been asked to come here and talk about not an area of professional expertise, but rather my professional life as an educator. And so this is going to be a little bit of a different kind of presentation than some that I've given in the past, and I look forward to getting feedback and opinions and thoughts from all of you, because this is something that's of real concern to me, not just as a professional educator, but as someone who lives here in Wichita and wants to better understand how to serve and how to be part of something that will benefit all of us to a certain degree. So, in any case, let's start out with James Chung. So, a lot of you have been following James Chung's work that he has done in association with the Wichita Community Foundation. Over the years, he has visited Wichita multiple times. He's worked closely with a lot of different civic groups and a lot of different business and different types of organizations. He's done a lot of analytical work to try to understand Wichita's struggles and Wichita's potential. In June of this year, he gave a presentation at the new Advanced Learning Library. And that presentation was, in a lot of ways, a culmination of much of the previous work that he had done. You can take a look at that report. It is available at the Wichita Community Foundation's website. You can watch the entire video. And you can see pretty clearly that he felt as though he had analyzed the city enough and thought about and talked to enough people who had thought about the city enough to come to some general conclusions. Two of those conclusions had to do with levels of financial investment in the city, both public and private, and had to do with the population of the city and shifts, particularly in regards to younger people not staying in Wichita. Both of those are important topics that deserve a whole lot of exploration. I'm going to talk solely about the second of the three topics he brought up, which is that he felt as though he saw in Wichita an anti-college attitude. I've never been in a city where people are so willing, proactively, to talk negatively about their higher education institutions and higher education in general. And here were some of the data points that he presented. His organization had conducted some polling in the city, and he contrasted the results of that polling to some national polling results. Would you say a college education is extremely important, very important, somewhat important, or not too important in helping a young person succeed in the world today? The national result that he presented to us said that 70% of the American people agreed with that statement, or at least would rank that statement extremely or very important. Wichita, significantly less, only 54%. Are colleges and universities having a positive or negative effect on the way things are going in the country these days? Once again, making use of some national survey research, he says that about 54% of the American people agreed with that statement, or rather, would rank their belief in the statement accordingly, whereas only 33% of Wichita residents said this. After presenting this information to us, and probably at least a few of you were there, John, you were there that night, and I'm betting a fair number of others were as well. After presenting this information, he said, what I don't think Wichita fully realizes is if it weren't for the innovation and the thinking of the higher education institutions in Wichita, we wouldn't even be in the game anymore. Now, again, I can't speak for John, or I can't speak for anyone else who may have been there that afternoon. But as I sat there, and I was actually sitting right beside President Amy Gregg Carey, the president of Friends University, I saw a lot of nodding. I heard a lot of murmured, yep, yep, yep. Now, presumably, there's a bit of a self-selection effect going on amongst the sort of people that would even choose to go out and listen to a presentation put on by the Wichita Community Foundation by someone who is here to analyze the city and figure out what it needs to do or what maybe it needs to do differently. Nonetheless, I think that those murmured yeps that I heard and those nods that I saw were reflecting the fact that this bit of data was touching upon something. It was touching upon a sensibility that many people recognized. Now, just because a lot of people recognize a sensibility doesn't mean that we understand it very well. And that's something that I want to get into in a moment. For now, let's just say that after he presented this, an awful lot of us educators that were there in the audience thought to ourselves, yeah, we want to understand this better. We want to dig into this anti-college attitude, and we want to see if there's ways in which we can address it. President Carey wrote something for the Wichita Eagle in which she set up some interesting comparisons about her past experience with higher education in the state of Minnesota and how she felt as though amongst all the different stakeholders, students obviously, but also parents, donors, alumni, others, that she had seen a much stronger general consensus about the value of higher education and the fact that it's worth paying for than she has experienced since becoming president of Friends University here in Wichita. For my own part, I started talking to people, and I felt I would maybe be able to add something to this conversation if I could get some people together, educators, political leaders, community activists, business people, and get them to share their thoughts about the Chung Report and provide their assessment of what this anti-college attitude that he reports on really involves. All right. Fortunately, I was able to put together this event, which took place in September. There were two panels that I organized, and I was going to present to these panels a couple of different related questions and get their feedback on them This first panel here, Yolanda Camarena, who's president or was president of the Kansas Hispanic Education and Development Foundation. Brandon Whipple, who's one of our state representatives representing the 96th District. Pete Meitzner, who was at the time still a council person, now former council person for District 2 of the Wichita City Council. And Rebecca Zevick-White, who is a former communications director for Kansas Opera. She's been a reporter, an attorney, and a campaign manager. Second panel, an additional variety of people. Chase Billingham, a sociologist at Wichita State University. Kelly McFall, a historian at Newman University. Matt Lindsay, president of the Kansas Independent College Association and Foundation. And Cindy Claycomb, who had a long career at Wichita State University and is currently a council person serving in the Wichita City Council from District 6. Besides these two panels I put together, I wanted to organize people around tables and provide them with some paper and pencils and ask them to record their thoughts about the presentations they heard and discuss amongst themselves questions and concerns they had about it all. When it was all said and done, I put together the comments from the different panelists. I went through and thought about and got back in touch with some people and followed up on some of the many comments from people that were present at the event. And I put together some comments of my own, which were published in the Wichita Eagle. We're going to come back to this in a second. But for now, I want to dig into some of the data that was presented by the different panelists. And I want to provide, as much as possible, some context to the argument that we were all having and that I think people in Wichita need to continue to have about our city's attitudes, our city's levels of investment, and in particular, our city's involvement in the ideal of higher education, and not just the ideal of higher education, but the practice of it as well. So I'm going to focus here for a little while on one of the presentations that was given, and then I'm going to make some broader comments that draw upon the other statements that were made. And then, like I said, we're going to come back to this and share some of my conclusions. And then, like I said at the beginning, I would love to open it up, and I would love to receive some additional thoughts or, some pushback on the different ideas that seem to me to have bubbled up through this whole process. So Chase Billingham, a sociologist at Wichita State University, has, since he arrived in Wichita about 7 years ago, really heavily invested himself in studying the history of the city. And he has, a fondness, let's put it that way, for data that I can't confess I really have. I can do data, I can run numbers, I can plot graph points, but I don't really especially enjoy it. Whereas Chase is a real quant. He likes digging into numbers. He takes numbers very seriously. And so his first thought when he heard James Chung's presentation is basically, where did you get this information? And how solid is this information? What was the poll that you conducted? What was the audience of the poll? He wanted to know the methodology. He wanted to understand it better. So this was the actual this was the actual slide that James Chung presented when he was first introducing his argument about anti-college attitudes in Wichita. Chase's response to this is pretty clear. He says, you're giving us this data, but you're not providing us with the sample size. You're not providing us with the participation rate. You're not telling us what the representativeness of this particular study is. Since we haven't gotten any more specific detail, and I have actually asked James Chung to his face, would you share with me, like, the complete poll that you did? And he didn't have anything to share with me. The conclusion is that, well, I mean, basically he did a flash poll. I mean, probably something a step or two above, some lame Survey Monkey thing that you can do online, but maybe not something a whole lot more sophisticated than that. So we don't have a really good picture of what the actual results are. We don't have a statistical display of the documentation that would support this judgment. And because we don't have those things, Chase wanted as much as possible to confront this argument with something that might be a little bit more reputable. And so, for example, James Chung contrasted the results of his polling here in Wichita with some national results. So James dug into those national results, which were actually from the Pew Research Center, which is an extremely reputable polling organization. They were quite dated, actually. He was making reference to a study that goes all the way back to 2011. And if you take a look at where those national numbers came from, you'll find that there's some other ways in which you could read that information. So the actual question was, is college worth it? And they drew their results from a question that asked people, what does a young person need to succeed in life? And you were able to rank things as extremely important, very important, not so important, and so forth. You can get a snapshot of this here. Some of the other things that they were able to measure against a college education were a good work ethic, knowing how to get along with people, work skills learned on the job, and so forth. Now, you put all of that together and you do see some genuine trends in regards to different populations, white versus black, male versus female. If you dig further into it, you can find different trends in regards to income level, in regards to region of the country. But the overall point that you need to take away from this is that the Pew Research Center itself didn't necessarily see this number as posing some sort of really dramatic standard against which, for example, a city like Wichita might come up as lacking against. Chase's conclusion is that what you see, to whatever extent you trust in the results of James Chung's report, is something that is probably more reflective of broad national economic trends, fears about the cost of education, fears that are very much able to be indexed to employment levels and hopes for the future and whatnot, and not something that you can create a direct apples to apples comparison to. His data, to whatever extent it is reliable, was something that was drawn in 2018, whereas he was setting up a comparison to national data that goes all the way back to 2011. There's a lot of different ways in which you could pull some of this apart. Now, with all that being said, I myself am not convinced that simply because you can show some holes in James Chung's data, simply because you can identify limitations in the people that he spoke to or the methodology by which he collected their answers, and particularly against the whole framework that he measured these answers. Despite all of those, I think, very legitimate complaints, I don't think he was simply blowing smoke. There were too many people around me that were nodding their heads. There were too many people around me that could provide anecdotal support for the kind of anti-college attitude he was talking about. I've been an educator here in Wichita since 2006. I've talked to lots of students. I've talked to lots of parents. I've talked to lots of alumni. I do recognize that there is some areas of concern in regards to the level of support or the level of appreciation of, or just the general understanding of college education, a university education here in Wichita that might contrast to other areas. So I'm not going to trust a whole lot in the specific numbers that James Chung's provides, but I am going to take seriously what I hear from other people. What I heard from other people, especially out of this event that we organized, listening to the different panelists and reading the comments from people in the audience, led me to develop a couple of broad sets of questions. One of them seemed to revolve around the issue of generational change. All right? A large percentage of Wichita's white male population was shaped by a history where higher education, at least as it most commonly exists as an opportunity today, didn't play as large a role in building a successful adult life. Those memories and that socialization lasts a long time, especially when the leadership classes most relevant to said socialization, family, business, church, politics, media, etc., often are not themselves strong proponents of or clearly shaped by a liberal arts or higher education friendly mentality. Do many of the second generation of possible higher education promoters and leaders move away, leaving Wichita behind? What I have done here is I have essentially condensed and formulated a paragraph on the basis of easily a dozen comments that were made by different people who participated in this event. People thinking about how, well, maybe there is kind of a gap between the seeming level of appreciation for education between men and women, or between the white majority in Wichita and our minority populations. Maybe there is the fact that Wichita's long history as a manufacturing hub, as a place where there were a lot of opportunities for people to find good paying jobs immediately after high school, even though that may no longer be the case, has had a continuing legacy that has shaped the way people have thought. And maybe that legacy has been to a degree promoted, simply because it happens to be that a lot of the people that tend to have positions of prominence within different civic organizations, within church boards, within businesses, within our political class, are themselves people that hold tightly to that legacy, as opposed to reflecting a different mentality, the sort of mentality that, for instance, President Kerry talked about as characterizing the state of Minnesota and the environment that she came out of. So we can think about that. Here's another one. Once again, this is probably over a dozen comments from both panelists and from people in the audience that I've summarized and tried to formulate into kind of a common statement. Many people look at the idea of higher education and see college loans only, a problem compounded by the tendency to downplay local, low-cost, or alternative higher education approaches and presume only prestigious, elite, and hence more expensive institutions count as real university-level education. I have to jump in here and add something. There were, out of all of the comments I collected, 3 people who pretty much explicitly said, well, of course they're not going to go to Wichita State. They've got to go to KU. Because I guess the former isn't really college and the latter is. I don't know. I would have loved to have pulled those people together into a separate study group. But I mean, it was like 3 times that was repeated. All of this, combined with a reluctance to invest in the future and a preference for immediate rather than long-term commitments, allows a mistrust of higher education to develop. College is too often considered in part as a scam, something disruptive and ultimately unimportant to the development of an independent person. There's a lot that I'm packing together here, just like there was a lot that I was packing together in the previous statement. There are things that you can pull apart and interrogate, not just in terms of economics, not just in terms of you know, personal goals and interests and needs, but things that you can, you know, go after on the level of philosophy, on the level of, you know, how you define what a good life is in the first case. In the first case. So, you know, I'm not presenting either of these two statements as a definitive conclusion. I'm presenting both of these statements as kind of the reflective outcome of a process of conversation that involved a lot of different people over a fair amount of time. The last point about an economic cultural problem can take us back to the argument that Chase Billingham made in his presentation, because he concluded that to the extent that there is an anti-college attitude, it really is simply a phenomenon of economic struggles over jobs and employment in the state of Wichita, or rather in the city of Wichita. And he sets this up by going back to what he thought was the last really solidly developed set of data that examined this question in Wichita. This is a survey that was conducted by the Knight Foundation back in 2010. You take a look at that, very, very obviously, people in Wichita are concerned about jobs. They're concerned about employment. They're concerned about the economy. Are they concerned about their education systems? Yeah, some of them are, a little bit, more than a whole bunch of other tiny little concerns, but certainly nothing that can compare with the dominant concerns. And Chase's conclusion was, Wichita isn't an outlier here. The same sort of thing can be found by taking a look at comparable studies of other communities all across the country. Are people everywhere concerned about higher education, whether they think it's worth it, whether they think it costs too much, whether they think it's important or relevant to life today? Yes, people are concerned. Some, a little bit, to a degree, but not nearly as much as they're concerned about general economic matters and employment matters. Okay? So his conclusion is Wichita either doesn't actually have an anti-college attitude, or if it does have an anti-college attitude, it's indistinguishable from that you see nationwide. I don't fully agree with him. Like I said, simply anecdotally, through my own observations and through my interactions with many other educators, they suggest to me that there might well be another variable that came into play. Is that variable an economic cultural one? Is it a generational or gender-based one? Is it both? I don't know. It's very, very difficult when you don't have really good data, and unfortunately James Chung did not present us with really good data, to drill down on any of those different issues. So I keep them in mind as things that have been brought forward to me, that have been presented and argued about, and they are things that I guess we will continue to think about into the future. On the basis of all of that, let me go back to the short column that I wrote for the Wichita Eagle, which I wrote up just a couple of weeks after the event back in September. This is what I wrote. Digging into Chung's numbers, looking at other measurements across the entirety of Wichita's population, and discussing the possibilities at length in community meetings, it is almost certain that the anti-college attitude he observed simply cannot be seen as a general one. Rather, to the extent it truly exists, it reflects the attitudes of a limited population group, a group whose attitudes are aligned with those of similar groups nationwide. But what is that group? Definitely not Wichita's ambitious and education-hungry immigrant Hispanic population whose enthusiasm for the higher education experience is palpable. Also likely not the many first-generation college students who are anxious to take advantages of opportunities for technical training and job certification, and who insistently appear more likely to stay in the area than traditional university graduates do. Nor is it Wichita's class of female professionals for whom higher education makes available new ladders they are excited to climb. No, perhaps the population which does reflect this anti-college attitude, again, to the extent it actually exists, is simply disproportionately influential in Wichita rather than actually large. Perhaps it reflects a local manifestation of something more general and national. A divide between education and diversity-oriented urban imperatives apparently felt by many younger and racially diverse Wichita residents, and the outlooks and priorities of many of our established civic, business, and social leaders on the other. Could it be that the passion for higher education and the recognition of its importance, which is obviously present in the lives of many, finds its enthusiasm somewhat undermined when various leadership classes within our city fail to celebrate or sometimes even reflect the sort of expertise or entrepreneurialism or open-mindedness or forward thinking which higher education and professional training is ideally supposed to be about? I don't have any definite conclusions about any of that. These are the ideas that have occurred to me. Like I said at the beginning, higher education as a topic, as a phenomenon, is actually not my area of expertise. I'm just a teacher. I'm someone who lives in higher education, and thus I am concerned about it. I've got kids now that are going on to higher education. I have a child who graduated from KU and is getting her librarian degree in Canada because, I don't know, they have libraries in Canada, I guess. No, she got a good scholarship, and they have this book history thing there, and so she's into that. And then I have another daughter who is much more sensible than the older daughter and is going to Friends for free. So I care about higher education. I care because it's my profession. I care because I'm a parent. I care because it affects the city of Wichita. And I'm sure in saying those things, I have captured feelings of many of you as well. So that is my presentation. I would love to hear any thoughts any of you may have. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the word he categorized as an anti-college feeling, particularly from Wichita. I think it's not really anti, it's more a matter of a lot of the good positions here in Wichita do not require an education, a college education. A car mechanic is far more important in this market than history. So I don't know, my feeling is it's not an anti-college, it's just a realization that there's a world of work that doesn't include college.
And I think that that's, an important point to make. We can, of course, get into arguments about, the actual, financial fortunes of, work that requires a college education versus work that doesn't require a college education. But you are definitely right that for Chung to have presented it as anti-college, even within his own terms, probably was more salesmanship than accuracy. I mean, what we're really talking about here, to whatever extent it exists, is not so much anti-college, though there is some of that, as it is kind of, college ambivalent or college irrelevant. What we're talking about here are a lot of parents and a lot of maybe community leaders that are saying, hey, if college is for you, then go for it, but don't think that it has to be for you. And that is not the same as an anti-college attitude. So that's an important point to bring up.
Dr. Fox.
Yes.
Deborah and I attended your discussion in September and enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
One of the things that came up at our table was the possibility, this is not a profound statement of any kind, but the possibility that some of these students that graduate from 259 aren't getting much out of it. Mm-hmm. And they sense that. And is that what education is all about, and I have to go pay for it now? That was just one thing that came up at our table. I don't know if you have any idea.
Well, no, I mean, I actually remember that comment being written down by someone that was at your table. And I think it's an interesting one. It's not a concern that seems to have been voiced by a lot of other people, but that doesn't mean that it's not valid. Obviously, if you have young people that do not, by and large, have a really good education experience, they are probably, by and large, going to look around at a lot of other alternatives before they say, oh, I guess I need more education now. It would be really interesting, once again, if we had better data, to go after that sort of thing. Because, I mean, if we truly had a fairly comprehensive set of polling data about this supposed anti-college attitude, then we would be able to break out young people from old people, and we would be able to maybe even break down, you know, different high school experiences, private versus public, or so forth. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That is an additional variable that ought to be kept in mind.
My experience with college, I did a WSU 20 years ago. And I haven't run as fast as today, but when I was there, many of my professors were extremely left-wing. And they didn't belong to the Communist Party, they didn't have no I feel that this is a perception that people have. Do you think this feeling that college education is liberal brainwashing has something to do with anti-college?
I mean, once again, and I'm going to, you know, sound like I'm just putting this on repeat here. That would be the sort of thing that better data, you know, might be able to help us out with. I know that I assumed that a lot of this attitude, however we want to describe it, to whatever extent it exists, has got to be a reaction to, you know, to real political concerns. I was expecting to see that come up a lot in people's conversations. It did not. Out of all of the comments that we collected, and again, this was by no means, you know, a reliable study, you know, so you can't take this as definitive proof or anything like that. But out of all the comments that came out of that discussion, out of all the table comments that we collected, only one mentioned anything having to do with, political ideologies in the classroom and the ways in which that can discourage people or create false impressions about education. That honestly surprised me. I really thought that I would see that mentioned more often. And maybe it is a real variable. I don't know. I mean, I appreciate, you know, your perspective, because I'm sure you're not alone in feeling that way. It's just that as things stand right now, I'm not really sure how much I can attribute politics in the classroom as something that either drives people away or drives people in to college education.
Dr. Fox?
Yes.
One more question over here, then we'll be over there.
I believe that vocational education is sometimes the better fit than university education for a student. What's your opinion on that?
Oh, I think that is absolutely the case. I think that the divide that has developed because of decades of specialization, because of the ways in which college has been funded, and the way in which the results of that funding have shaped the way we think about college. I think all of this has resulted in a widespread attitude that higher education means this particular sort of thing. It's on a particular sort of level. And vocational education is this different sort of thing entirely on a different, lower level. And I think that that's terrible. I think that it does not serve people well. It certainly does not serve a flourishing society well. I'm not sure that we know an easy way to break away from that. Given the way the wage system operates, given the way the media operates, I don't know of any obvious way to convince people to stop with the divide between the two. It's sociological and cultural as much as anything else. As far as how that all relates into this discussion, to the extent that people might see vocational education as something that, because of that aforementioned divide, is dramatically different from higher education and therefore has to be constructed as an opposite to it, that could certainly contribute to these attitudes. I mean, there is no real reason for somebody who gets vocational training and finds a flourishing career to necessarily feel that their doing so has taken place in opposition to those eggheads and idiots up there at Wichita State or KU or some Ivy League school. There's no necessary reason for them to think that way, but that sort of thinking does exist. And like I said, I don't know of any obvious way to address the divides that have developed between the two over the decades.
Thank you for being here. I think you may have just answered my first question. I've got two if I could. But I was going to ask you, can you define college education? And for example, if I go to a night school at a tech, or night class at a tech school and I take CNC training and then I'm off to a job, is that college education?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that I think is really important to be aware of. That was something that Pete Meitzner emphasized in his presentation. He said people, when they see higher education, they're not thinking Wichita Technical College, which is not Wichita Technical College anymore. It is now, what is it now? WSU Tech, right. They're not thinking that, okay? And that kind of is a byproduct of the divide that I was thinking of before. People imagine that, if I'm going to WSU Tech, then I'm not really going to college. I'm not really partaking in higher education. Higher education is this other thing somewhere else. And unfortunately, that can result in, bad attitudes getting lumped together. So, yeah, I mean, for myself, I would like as much as possible to struggle against that divide, to recognize that there's a whole lot more in common between WSU Tech and Friends University and Wichita State and KU and any of these other schools. There's a whole lot more similar between them than there is that separates them. But that's a hard case to make.
And if I can, one more, I'd just love to hear your attitude on, or your comments on how much of the, as we'll call it, the attitude toward college may possibly stem from the K-12 lawsuits that we've seen through the past several years, and just some of the overall hatred that is spewed out of the K-12 administrative levels.
I'm not sure I understand what you're asking me to respond to. So help me out here. So we've already touched on the idea that, somebody might have a really bad experience with high school education, and so therefore they're maybe not as interested in college, even if it would be of benefit to them. Are you suggesting that people read about the fights between the state government and the school districts of Kansas, and that kind of overflows into turning them off on education in general, or are you talking about something different?
No, I'm just questioning if you may think there's a correlation there.
I've never thought about that. That's interesting, because presumably you're looking at a different slice of the population there. You're looking at people, parents, that are going to be helping their kids go to college, and they're taxpayers, and so they're looking at these sorts of fights, and you're saying, well, they've gotten dissatisfied with education as a whole because of all of these arguments. I can't say I have an opinion on that. That's a really interesting thought. I have not considered that before. Hi, Bob.
Hi, Dr. Fox. So James Chung, besides the data you presented today, he's presented a great deal of economic data.
Right.
Income, economic output and so forth. Do you think that there's cause to be skeptical of his presentation of those figures because they're pretty grim, yet our political leadership, most notably the mayor and the chair of the county commission, they believe we have great momentum. We've had great momentum going forward.
Well, this is why we value having, real data burrowers like yourself who can dig into that stuff better than me. My general impression, certainly engaging with this over the months has kind of shaped my attitude towards James Chung's analytics in general. I suppose overall, when I take a look at what he has to say about levels of investment, what he has to say about outmigration, what he has to say about different sorts of economic concerns, I guess my general attitude is the same across the board. I do think, contrary to some, I do think that Chung's work has identified real areas of concern. I do think that he is reflecting real trends that that are negative and need to be addressed. I am less convinced than maybe I used to be at the reliability of every particular claim that he makes about the city, and and the conclusions that follow from that. So there you go. That's probably where I stand.
Dr. Russell Fox, thank you.